So we're going to shift for a moment. We've been looking at some of the different mechs. We've been talking about Lance builds and looking at some machines, my favorites, your favorites, for the new players. For the new players, pushing this up to the channel, pushing this up to the archive. Surviving city fights, surviving city tech. Things change. Once you switch to that urban environment, things become a lot more deadly with the base rules, especially if you're layering on combined arms, where now you can have infantry and tanks. So I want to kind of push out a couple of ideas, general scenarios, things and points to keep in mind when you enter an urban environment. And this could be something as complex as just here's a gigantic city map. The whole thing is a city. Or often what we'll see is the definition of city tech, these pockets of buildings, right? You could have open grasslands and a couple of low-lying hills, but in the center is a spaceport, 6 or 7 buildings, a landing pad, maybe a drop ship. That would incorporate city fight, city tech, and your opponent might move there to fortify up. You might move there to fortify up. The mission might be take that drop ship. Don't blow it up. Take it. So at some point in your Battletech journey, you're going to find yourself in a city, and you can be quickly overwhelmed and have a few points and ideas to keep in mind. So the first thing is with city tech, city fight, things are going to be close. You're not going to necessarily have long lanes of fire, and if you do, they can easily be sidestepped. And what I mean by that is, think about one of the classic hex maps. You can take your archer and park it on top of a hill, slight elevation, and really draw a line of sight to a lot of things. Yes, you'll eat some return fire, but you can have these long, literally long hex map lanes of fire that you can move to. City fight, you'll have some roads, but there's spaces in between buildings. There's pockets, there's twists, there's turns. So I can be at the end of the street and you're moving up to fire on me, and maybe you get off that first shot, but then I sidestep down another street, or I sidestep between a building. It's also possible with machines that have some okay speed, even some assault mechs, to be up behind a building alongside a street and slowly make your way up. You're not firing every turn, but I can slowly make my way up where I'm behind a building, come around the building, and move to the next building. Then come around from that building, move to the next building, slowly creep up. So what you're going to see is that mechs can kind of stay hidden until the last moment when they want to be revealed. And at that point, often what we see, it's especially with heavy and assault mechs that have a variety of weapons, not just long-range weapons, but many short-range weapons. SRM packs, short-range missile packs, medium lasers, machine guns. They're extra deadly in city fight because they can literally move and creep up on you and suddenly appear there, and they're firing all of their weapons. So it's not like they're at a long range and that Battlemaster's firing that PPC. Okay, you're bobbing, you're weaving, you're keeping your modifiers up, but you're out of the threat range of all of its weapon systems. City fight is very, very up close. What this also means is to be aware of physical attacks. Now, if you're playing with me, or if you've had the good fortune to play Battletech, or I should say I've had the good fortune to play Battletech with you, I mean, I'm going to run up there and try and punch you, drop kick you, death from above. I mean, glory calls for it, but you could try to stay away from it. In a city environment, just by the proximity of being so close, physical attacks are all over the place. So a machine like a grasshopper, or a machine like a hunchback can be moving up, shooting, get point blank, shoot, punch, utilize all these aspects. Damage stacks a lot faster. So what you'll see is maybe a little bit of sniping, a lot of movement, and then all of a sudden, you're 3 or 4 hexes away, and everything's just firing all over the place. So be aware of the machines that you're going in with, and be aware of that distance and timing of the other mechs. Let's also talk about ambushers, because now this is where certain vehicles that can put out a lot of alpha, the classic example, the short-range missile carrier. First time you look at that sheet, look in the tech manual, you think it's a misprint. How could something carry this many short-range missiles? I mean, it's just insane. And the foil, or the aspect working against it, is it's got no armor, can't rotate, it's okay speed. If that's out in the open, Or if that's on a classic Battletech map, it's just going to get picked off and blown up. Well, city fight means vehicles like that can hide. They can stay behind buildings. A great example is if you have to go down a street because that's the main way to get to the objective, and I park 2 short-range missile carriers behind buildings. That's going to be a challenge to dig out. You're going to have something specific, maybe indirect fire, maybe some lights to be able to jump over the buildings and jump behind it. It's going to be a pain. You're not just going to walk forward. So suddenly what you see is the ability, if you have vehicles that have a short-range punch, to literally, you're going to have to go block by block, cluster by cluster of hex maps to make any progress. I mean, it is really, really brutal. And likewise, everything, these checkpoints and questions that I'm raising for you, these are tactica that you're going to utilize and raise for your opponent. There's 2 levels of city fight, and not necessarily sub-levels, although I'm sure somewhere out there someone has created a city map with sub-levels, like an underground facility or underground transportation that mechs could go through. That would actually be pretty cool, but pulling in that Necromunda vibe. But this idea of you can be on top of the buildings too, especially if they're very dense. So suddenly mechs that have jump jets, they can jump up to the top of the buildings, be moving across there, make very, very quick progress, not necessarily be exposed to fire on the ground. I mean, depends on the elevation, depends on the range, but being able to jump down. So you could have a mech somewhere and I'm fighting with you, and then you're bringing up some light mechs that suddenly can be on the other side of the street, literally separated by buildings, jump on top, jump over, and engage me. So jump jets, I won't say they're mandatory, but they offer up a massive, massive range of tactica that's possible. The next aspect, infantry are suddenly God mode. Low battle value. If you can deploy them ahead of the battle, even if you can't deploy them ahead of the battle, you got some Karnovs, you got some transports, you got some fast-moving stuff. Heck, even if they're just jump infantry, moving into buildings, suddenly they gain the cover aspects of buildings against most weapons, and they're just going to blast you. Something like a light mech is suddenly very scared. I remember a game, I was playing my Locust, and I had sent out some Locusts to go into a city to kind of outflank my opponent who had some missile carriers in the back. And we're going to talk indirect fire because that indirect fire really, really helps with city fight. Same thing with artillery and clearing buildings. So we're going to hold that thought, hold that tactica point for a minute, and clear run down this street, 15, 20 hexes of street. It was like the Grand Boulevard, just running down buildings on either side. Infantry packed in all those buildings. So I knew running at my highest speed, I was going to get hit with 4 or 5 or 6 infantry stands. Okay, before we even do battle value calculation, what are they going to need? 11s and 12s to hit me? But if they do, actually probably less than that. I think they needed about 10s because they were literally 1 hex away. The challenge, of course, right there, that's a lot of stuff to eat. That's a lot of firepower. That's a lot of a spread. That can cripple a light mech. It could, infantry become very deadly because now, as your heavies and assaults take lots of damage and now move to internals, you could try to hide that from mechs, depending on positioning, facing. You're not going to be able to hide that from infantry, and they're just going to soak you. Against vehicles, infantry are amazing because they can be in buildings and try and snipe and try and get side armor, try and hit motive hits. I mean, infantry for the battle value are just amazing. So you need a way to dig them out because you can't always avoid them. So suddenly mechs with machine guns are very, very potent, very, very powerful. Suddenly mechs with machine guns are mechs we want to target if I have a large infantry force, because that's going to make other things much more difficult to dig out. So moving into Destructibles, and this is kind of interesting with Battletech. The environment, for the most part, you can destroy. So these buildings, depending on light, medium, heavy, fortified, reinforced, there's different rules, but they're going to have these structure points. And when you blow them up, they collapse to the ground. So they create rubble. But likewise, if things are on top of the building and it might have a basement adding another level, you could take falling damage. You can collapse buildings on vehicles that might be hidden in there. You can destroy buildings. You can affect buildings. So you now suddenly have another use for those autocannon 20s, although ammo is limited. So the environment is destructible. And what that means is I would suggest having a way to clear a path. In higher battle value games where I can kind of get all my toys and get redundancy in there, I often take groups of Demolisher tanks, and they are brutal in City Fight because the nature of the autocannon 20 is an example. And again, we're talking of examples here, so you're going to fill in your own tactica, your own units. When you look at an autocannon 20, the main thing is the range. You can stay out of range and just blast me with long-range stuff, long-range missiles, autocannons. If we're in a city scenario, those buildings are protecting me. Those buildings giving me places to hide. Those buildings kind of cut down on the avenues and allow me to approach. I'm on a turret. So if I get immobilized or you suddenly appear behind me, I flip that turret around. Demolisher has 2 autocannon 20s, so we've got the redundancy going. Besides mech busting, I will use it to along with PPCs. PPCs are a little bit preferred because there's no ammo, but they might take a little longer depending on the scenario and the buildings. The ability to blow up buildings and create a path that you can move through so things can't necessarily hide behind them. Or if there's those missile carriers, short-range missile carriers, to be able to blow up the buildings to flush them out, to remove cover, to get rid of infantry, to kind of deal with these aspects. Having Destructibles is key. Artillery, by its nature, too, could be useful. Now, there's some spread, there's some randomness, there's some drift, but artillery gives you the chance to not only start blowing up buildings in an area, but if your opponent is clustered up or on a mission, or if there are structures of buildings laid out in such a way that they offer an awesome fortification point. You'll see these kind of in the classic map, these I'm trying to think of the way to describe it, plus structure buildings. It's like a plus sign, and there's 4 elements and they're placed together. That's great because literally it's like a bunker. You can hide behind them if they're placed in a group, jump over them, move around them. I'm going to park like 4 or 5 mechs there. I'm going to park everything there and just use that as a fire base. Well, you key in some artillery right there, even with the drift, something's going to hit. So you see that ability changes very, very fast, very, very fluid. So now let's jump into Indirect Fire. This is the ability, really quick for those of you new to Battletech, if you have a long-range missile type weapon, no matter what the spread is, the idea is because they're long-range and they're semi-guided, not really guided rockets, although there's some sort of guidance, you can shoot them on an arc and kind of hit a certain area. So the idea is like you're calling in a strike. You need a spotter. Great example. Spotters are deadly in a city. You've got a couple of warriors up there spotting. You've got a Karnov. You've got a Karnov dropping off some infantry in the center. They're calling in that strike. So the idea is a spotter is telling your archer, your longbow, your whatever, hey, key in on this coordinate and fire. So you're going to take into account range. You're going to take into account possibly cover depending on the perspective of the spotter. There's going to be some penalties that get added on. It's going to be a little bit harder to hit, but now you have the ability to hit things hidden, again, assuming you're in range. So that archer, that longbow, those machines with long-range missile 20 packs, long-range missile carriers, both on the offensive and defensive, hidden behind buildings, can indirect fire. Now, if you just have an LRM-5 or just 1 or 2, yeah, you might get lucky. Even if you get lucky, it's not going to do much damage. But this is why you'll often see long-range missile carriers or LRM boats like an Archer, just 2 Archers, or an Archer and a long-range missile carrier. That's a lot of missiles every turn, firing indirect with a good spotter. That opens up tons of tactica. So if you're defending, you want to have long-range missiles. Heck, even if you're attacking, you want to be able to have those long-range missiles just to put some threat on it. An example from a game a little while ago, we were engaged in a city, we were moving forward, we had to take the spaceport. Opposing forces were dug in. It was kind of attacker-defender. And while we were both converging on the same spot, my opponent had arrived at the landing pad a little bit quicker. Of course, in true Fritz fashion, I'm sitting there like heavies, assaults, heavy tanks. So I was slower. They had a more balanced list. So they arrived at the spaceport. That shifted the role of they're the defender, I'm the attacker. There were some interesting points there, so I had to keep on pushing. I couldn't approach any different way. I had to be very direct because I didn't want my opponent to get established. Putting mechs in key positions, putting vehicles, advancing infantry. They were in the center, but I had to get up there quick. They had a Jenner moving along up the flank. Now, normally I would engage that Jenner. Jenner is a threat. Even though it's a light mech, it's got speed, it's got mobility, it's got more weapons than like a medium mech, or it has weapons equal to a medium mech, even if there's heat challenges. But I needed to deal with it. But I couldn't break anything off because I didn't want to do that. I couldn't do that. I fired my long-range missiles. I had 3 long-range missile carriers, and I tagged it, and I blew off its leg, and it was just now essentially out of the game. Yes, luck was on my side. But I illustrate that because, and yes, I had redundancy, meaning more than just one pack. But being able to do that was massive, a little bit of luck, but that changed this city fight because otherwise that mech would have made it up there. On a classic map, hex map of grasslands or hills, I'd probably start firing with some autocannon fire. I'd have enough, some PPC fire. I'd have enough to drive it off. But it knew that it could slowly sneak up this city, slowly move up this city, and then I'd be in trouble. So those are a couple of points. And I find, well, I was going to say if I could have my preferred way to play Battletech, I want to play any mission, I want to play any mech, I want to play any type of stuff. But I really, really love the flavor, the feeling, the narrative of city-based games and the massive damage that you can do and the tactica and everything involved from that, just jumping off buildings, death from above, and all sorts of crazy, crazy stuff. But as you move into your Battletech experience, as you move from the Game of Armored Combat core set and the other starter set, and you start looking at some of the different maps, creating your own maps, building your own terrain, at that point, when you find yourself in a city or you create this massive city, Fritz, I printed out all these 3D buildings, and I've got like 60 of them, it's a whole table. That's going to require some different tactica. That's going to challenge you as a mech warrior. That's going to challenge you as a mech commander. So now I'm going to turn it over to you guys in the comments for the new players. We're building up the archive here, and I always appreciate the feedback, but I really appreciate the kindness of your time and your Battletech experience, double, triple than what I have, to leave comments on my videos and push that out there. So as new players come in, because I have gotten a lot of feedback, new players coming into the game, they're like, hey, I jumped into this Battletech thing. I can't be beaten by my friends. I'll never hear the end of it. So I need to get this tactica. The comments have been extremely helpful for them. Extremely, extremely helpful. It's essentially like a MechWarrior Academy, and you're piloting that chameleon and you're just kind of learning the game. A very, very amazing resource. So I appreciate that. The new players appreciate that. And as always, your comments and feedback, I'm taking that just as I hope you're taking my tactica, making my game better. I'm using that as long as I can control my own heat on the table and not just go totally crazy with autocannon 20s, to take that tactica and use it to win.